Hi friends, today we're going to learn some watercolor and gouache painting techniques. First thing I want to start with is it's really important when you're using watercolor that you use the right paper. So you're going to want to use a nice thick piece of watercolor paper. This is 140 weight paper. And you're going to also want to make sure that you tape it down. So you'll notice mine is taped there on the corners because watercolor is a paint that uses a lot of water. And so the paper you're using has to be able to withstand that amount of water without tearing. So the other thing you want to make sure is that you have a really nice watercolor set to begin with. For this video, I'm going to talk about watercolor first, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about gouache. Gouache is a bit different than watercolor, so we'll talk about all of the differences later on in the video. But for now, we're going to start off with basic watercolors that you might be used to. So some of the other things you'll need is obviously water, and then there's a variety of different brushes. So you'll definitely want to have some bigger ones, some smaller ones, and then later on I'll also show you about water brushes because they are cool as well. So first thing we're going to talk about is what's called a wash. So with watercolor, it's meant to be used in a way where you use a lot of water. So to start, we're going to talk about some basic techniques you use when using watercolor. The first we're going to talk about is called wet on wet, and that is when you wet your paper and then you put wet watercolor on top of that. So I'm going to show you what that looks like real quick. So I'm using a big brush because I know I'm going to use a lot of water, and I'm just dipping here in some water, and then I'm going to just put some clean water right here on my paper. Then I'm going to go over to my watercolor palette. I'm going to choose a color. For this one I'm going to do red, and I'm going to wet that paint, not too much, just a little bit, and get some paint on my brush, and then I'm going to go over the area of the paper that I had already wet. And what this does is it will keep your paint from leaving streaks and marks, and it makes it so you can get a nice what's called wash of paint. And usually you might use a wash in a background or when you want to fill a large area with color. It's also really easy to blend everything because your paper is nice and wet to start with. And then from here, this is something you probably would let dry and then add more details onto in a little bit. When using watercolor, it's really important that you understand that the amount of water you use changes how opaque or transparent your paint is. So for example, I have this nice red wash that I have here. Now I'm going to grab my brush. I'm just going to wet it a little bit. I'm going to go back into that red palette, but I'm going to try to keep my brush on the edges and not get that big puddle of paint, but just kind of get some of the drier areas. And now I'm going to go into a different spot of my paper where I did not put water first. So this is a dry paper. And I'm going to do just a little bit here to show you. So you can see how, it's a little bit glare, you can see how that is much brighter than the wash we just did, and yet that is the exact same paint. So I think watercolor artists often forget that part of using watercolor is using it in its different thicknesses to show different values, different shades. So what I could do from here is I could let that dry, and then in a little bit I could paint over it with some other paint. Now, if I were to wet it a lot, you'll see that it would get all. So from here, while this line is still wet, what I can do is I can come in with some clean water and just kind of right on the edge and just kind of pick up some of that paint that's still wet. And what that's going to do is that's going to give me a nice blending ability. So now I can create a similar fade, but it'll just be a bit thicker. And then from here I could blend this all the way out. I could add another color and blend right on my paper. So what's cool about watercolors is, unlike acrylic paints, you don't have to always mix your colors, say, in a little tray, something that looks like this. So you don't always have to do this with watercolors. You can actually mix your colors right on the paper. So if I wanted to turn this reddish area a little more orange, I could just very easily use a clean brush, go into my yellow, and put some yellow kind of right next to it for now. And then from there, I can blend, and I end up with a really nice orange. Another thing to keep in mind with watercolor is that it usually dries a bit lighter than it looked when you put it on. So if you kind of have something that looks really dark, just let it dry before you make any decisions about changing how dark or light it is, because it does tend to change over time as it dries. So another general painting tip is that brushes are meant to do different things. So a pointy brush like this is meant to make nice straight lines. It's also really useful when you're doing something like plants where you want to paint leaves. And I think that people don't always realize that different brushes are meant to do different things. So I'm going to paint kind of a plant here. So I'm using the brush to give me this nice stroke, and then of course as the paint comes off the brush, it gets lighter. So it's just kind of like nice happy accidents that happen when you learn how to use your tools properly. Another thing I'm going to show you is using two colors for the same leaf. So I'm going to come back in and grab some of that olivey green. And for this, I'm going to use my brush to its fullest capabilities. I'm going to put the point of it right next to the branch, and I'm going to push down. And then as I push down, I'm going to twist the brush. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me a beautiful leaf with very minimal effort. So now I'm going to also add some of that other green. So we're going to do a little mixture here of two greens. So I'm pushing. I'm going to start at the bottom of my plant. I'm going to push down with my brush, drag, and twist. Now if it gets really kind of rough like that, you just need a little more water on your brush. So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do push down, drag, and twist. Now if I keep going all the way up, and then of course as you get closer to the top, usually the leaves would get smaller. So it's really good to learn how to use your tools properly, and this is just one way that you can use your brush.